Hey kiddos, at the end of this week we're going to start reading Laura Esquivel's Like Water for Chocolate. In order to better understand this novel, we're going to talk today about magical realism, which is the genre that this novel falls in. Some quick background information. In the middle of the 19th century, there was a rise of a movement called Realism. Realism was a rejection of the Romantic movement. The Romanticists were very into intuition and nature, and they were not necessarily the most honest in depicting what life was actually like. They depicted what it should be. Realism was a depiction of things as they were. They felt they had an ethical responsibility to be honest and show life as it truly was. Typically, that meant that they would portray middle and lower classes and the daily struggle they had to exist. They were very into social activism at the time and rejected the idea that the only person who could have an interesting life to tell a story about was the upper class. This sort of ties into what we read in Antigone, where in a Greek tragedy back in ancient Greece, the only person that had anything worth losing was someone who is of the upper class. Realism totally rejects this idea. About 100 years after the rise of realism came the rise of magical realism, which is a literary genre and an artistic movement. Initially, the term was used to refer to art. Franz Roh, in 1925, who is a German art critic, referred to a particular style of German art as being magical realism. Arturo Uslar Pietri applied the term to literature, specifically to literature of Latin American writers. At the time, a lot of Latin American writers were going to Europe and seeing these fantastical works of art in Europe that were being displayed, and they incorporated that into their fiction, and thus came the rise of magical realism. So what is magical realism, you may ask? One author described magical realism as the ordinary as miraculous and the miraculous as ordinary. Magical realism takes magical elements and makes them appear in an otherwise realistic setting. It's a combination of the physical reality of the world and the psychological reality of the world. So it's not only what is actually there, but what is taking place inside of the mind of the characters and the writer. But wait, Miss McClellan, isn't that just fantasy? Well, no. The difference between magical realism and fantasy is that magical realism remains grounded in the real world. In fantasy novels, you go to fantastic places like Narnia or Middle-earth, places that don't actually exist. In magical realism, you stay in the world in which we already live. Magical realism stretches the definition of realism and reality. It pushes the boundaries of these things by suggesting that these fantastical elements can exist in our world. And it's not necessarily about a belief that these things happened, but it's a lack of disbelief. The author doesn't question that these things happened or didn't happen. They just accept them as being a part of their reality. And the power lies not in the answers, but in the questions themselves, in the questioning of these things. So, some common literary conventions that are used in magical realism. Magical realism juxtaposes opposite elements. So you have things that seem like they don't go together, but they somehow manage to incorporate them together in magical realism. Things like dreaming and waking, things like life and death, things like being civilized and being wild. These things are put together next to each other and exist in seeming harmony, even though we as readers understand that they shouldn't go together. There's also, as you would probably expect, a strong use of hyperbole. We exaggerate what happens until it becomes magical. It's not just you caught a fish, but you caught a fish that was so big that it could feed a village for 3 weeks. That is a magical element. And it takes a childlike look at the familiar, the charm of the object. There's a reimagining of the mundane, the everyday, as being this fantastical thing. And it engages the reader into the text. The text functions as a mirror to reflect things back at us as part of ourselves, and it forces a questioning of our own reality. One of the other common literary conventions used in magical realism is the use of archetypes. Characters that we encounter in magical realistic novels are not necessarily supposed to be the kinds of characters that we see in realistic fiction, where they represent their own individual and we're supposed to see them as a real person. Often, these characters, particularly minor characters, are meant as symbols. They're meant to represent a group of people or some other larger convention that isn't an individual. That is their purpose. There's also this thing called authorial reticence. And what that is we don't get from the author any kind of clear opinion as to whether or not these things actually happened. They don't want to get involved in questioning those things or events. There is a distance between the magical world of this novel and the author, but there is a strong respect that the author has for the magical elements in the story. For example, in Like Water for Chocolate, the narrator is Tita's great niece, and Tita is the main character. The great niece is telling the story of Tita, and she is not questioning the magic, but she is so far removed by generations from the magic that it doesn't apply to her life. The other thing that we especially are going to see in Like Water for Chocolate is a richness in sensory detail. You can tell this just by opening the book because we know that this book is told in recipes. So there's a lot of sensory detail related to food. But sensory detail isn't just about that. It's smell, touch, taste, sight, and sound. So you want to be looking for all of those. Being set in Latin America also has an impact on these texts. They impact the setting because the landscape of Latin America is so incredibly varied. Um, in the novels, the landscape is often vast and mysterious terrain. In Latin America, the geography ranges from snow-capped mountains to volcanoes to wide prairies to Amazonian waterfalls to desert. There's also a native influence in these texts. There's a blend of the old mystical cultures of the Mayans and the Aztecs with colonization, the influence of Western culture, and the rise in Christianity, specifically Catholicism. Some common themes that show up in magical realism are the following. Time is a common theme. In magical realism novels, time is often cyclical, meaning it goes in a circle. Things that happen once will happen again. Or the novel is written so that time is non-existent. There is also an incorporation of the carnivalesque. You're thinking Mardi Gras here, Carnival. There is a focus in the carnivalesque on the body, the senses, and relations between humans. And often there is an incorporation of a madman or a fool or a clown, and that character is supposed to reveal to us something deeper about society or about ourselves. There's also an idea of rebellion, particularly in Latin American magical realism novels. Mostly this is political rebellion, rebellion against the Western colonial forces, but also it can be individual rebellion. We see Tita rebelling in the novel against her mama, Elena, who is putting all these restrictions on her. And there's an idea of cultural mixing. There is a mixing of the native culture and the Western culture. There's a mixing of traditional religion and Catholicism. All of these things incorporate and play into one sort of melting pot of a culture that plays a part in this text. What I have for you here is a video that I pulled from YouTube that illustrates magical realism in contemporary video games. You should watch this for a deeper understanding of magical realism and how it's incorporated into even contemporary texts that you see every day.